In the soft, humming quiet of a 1950s morning, the average American housewife embarked upon her beauty regimen with the kind of seriousness typically reserved for military drills or royal coronations. She might not have been expecting guests, or even leaving the house, but her eyebrows would be arched into symmetrical perfection, and her shoes would gleam with the sort of luster you'd expect from a Cadillac showroom. The idea, you see, was that beauty wasn't just a personal responsibility, it was a civic one. One simply did not frighten the milkman with bare lips. Of course, the tools of the trade were quite a bit louder back then. The first sound of the day might have been the mechanical whir of a heat-set hairdryer, which looked and behaved like a prop from a B-grade sci-fi film. They were hooded monstrosities, desk lamp-sized helmets that clamped down over one's skull and roared like a Buick left idling in February. And while today we pop on a hair wrap and toss on a Silky podcast, back then it was 45 minutes of sonic turbulence while reading Reader's Digest or contemplating the mysterious contents of Jell-O salads. Hair, in fact, was a serious business. Rollers, warm, cold, foam, and steel, were weapons of follicular war, curled nightly or early morning like tiny cannonballs of conformity. Those large curlers that looked like miniature stovepipes. They weren't a fashion accessory accidentally fallen from a chimney sweep. No, they were artillery in the battle for the perfect wave. And women slept in these. Slept. In metallic mine traps, all in the hope of producing neat, gravity-defying clouds of coiffure by dawn. Makeup was its own ceremonial rite, choreographed with the reverence of a sacred ritual. First came the cold cream, a thick, waxy paste applied with such dedication you'd think its purpose was to ward off possession. Next, pancake makeup, named not for its appeal, but because it resembled compressed breakfast cake. Using a damp sponge, women would apply it to their faces with the solemnity of plastering a wall before hanging the family portrait. It had all the softness of modeling clay and all the breathability of a burlap sack. Then, the eyebrows. Oh, the brows. Across the juicy span of the decade, America's collective eyebrow standards veered from the pencil-thin whisper of the early 50s, barely their arches threatening to vanish altogether, to the slightly bolder statement brows of the late decade, which were still rather whispery statements, more passive-aggressive note than full declaration. Then rouge, now called blush, though the name change implies it does the work for you. Back then, rouge was a visible announcement that you were alert, feminine, and probably married. Applied in generous circles on the apples of the cheeks, it occasionally wandered higher, ending up somewhere near the temples, depending on lighting, nerves, and whether one's child had just shoved a grape into the radio. Let us not forget the red lipstick, the holy grail, the finishing touch, the bold funnel through which every 1950s beauty look passed. Reds were not optional. They were essential. The spectrum ranged from raspberry surrender to crimson command, colors grounded in the notion that an unpainted mouth was like an unironed blouse, unforgivable, and probably communist. Now here's a quaint little trick popular in exactly zero beauty routines today: tape and string. Facial contouring using Scotch tape may sound like something invented by a sleep-deprived art student, but it was touted in women's magazines as a way to train your face overnight. You quite literally taped your jowls northward, like a sailor battening down loose rigging in a storm, and hoped for gravity obedience by morning. Try it sometime and report back from the fifth dimension. And speaking of facial flexibility, some households owned a contraption magnificently named the Rejuvenike Electric Facial Mask, a mid-century precursor that looked like something a crime-fighting robot might wear during brunch. It promised facial lifts through small electric shocks, because what better way to wake up than with a gentle, strategic zapping across your T-zone? All of this was tucked into a daily dance that started before dawn and ended with a bottle of Pond's cold cream, stripping off the armor, resetting the canvas, and beginning again the next day. A routine that was simultaneously exhausting and comforting, and entirely reflective of an era that found dignity in the details, even if those details involved heating your eyelashes with a metal comb wrapped around a matchstick. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, rest easy. The curlers won't bite tonight. Before we can understand what made 1950s beauty routines so gloriously complicated and unapologetically noisy, we must first step, ever so delicately, into the boudoir. Now, the word boudoir may sound fancy, and it was, especially in mid-century America, where it conjured up soft lighting, pastel walls, and a very particular sense of domestic theatre. A sanctuary in satin slippers, if you will. But let's keep our eyes peeled, not too wide, for what was really going on beyond the powder puff smoke and smiling magazine covers, because behind every tidy housewife hairstyle lurked a prolonged ritual powered by hissy machines and enough talcum to fog up a Buick. Let's start with the hair. Every morning, before the sun had fully committed to rising, and before the husband had shuffled into the kitchen, grumbling about percolated coffee, many women were already 15 minutes into the gentle drone of the hairdryer hood, a contraption that looked suspiciously like the top half of a NASA prototype and sounded exactly like it had plans to launch. These devices, lovingly known as bonnet dryers, were the descendants of the earlier, wildly dangerous versions involving belts, hoses, and the sort of airflow that could strip paint off the living room trim. But even by the 1950s, they remained a commitment. To dry one's hair under a bonnet dryer was to more or less book an appointment with immobility. You sat, you baked. You tried to read a magazine between the gusts of hot air and the thumping rhythm of your own heart, made suddenly aware by the echoing space helmet of female grooming. And then it got louder. Because after the drying came the setting. Hair setting wasn't just a phase, it was a lifestyle. Women pinned their curls with tiny, treacherous tools called rollers, several dozen of them, and the average suburban bathroom countertop at 6:45 a.m. looked like a glamorous hardware store backsplash. The rollers were clipped in with a hope, a prayer, and sometimes a bobby pin to the forehead. Those with a higher threshold for discomfort might sleep in them overnight, which was essentially like resting your head gently on a basket of walnuts. Next came the face, the battlefield of base, blush, and eyebrow architecture. For reference, the average makeup routine in the 1950s took approximately 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes were dense, like a fruitcake. First, cleansing. Cold cream was the favored balm, smeared all over the face with determination and the vague look of someone preparing to enter combat. This was followed by vigorous tissue wiping, a process that looked gentle in advertisements but resembled amateur archaeology in practice, like excavating a cheekbone with a wad of paper towel. Then, the foundation. Cake. Not the delicious kind, sadly, but the foundation in a thick pressed powder compact that came in 3 flattering shades: alabaster, beige, and other beige, applied with a sponge puff or, for the truly ambitious, a wedge of cotton 1 step removed from being mattress stuffing. Precision was key, and the end result had to render the face utterly matte, as if the skin had retired early and moved into a desert climate. Eyebrows took time, lips took longer, and eyeliner. Well, eyeliner in the 50s was equal parts art and extreme sport. 1 tiny twitch, and suddenly you were Cleopatra on one side and a raccoon on the other. All of this unfolded in front of mid-century vanity mirrors, gleaming fixtures surrounded by blinding Hollywood bulbs that made it entirely impossible not to see each and every pore currently attempting to rebel. Combine this with the smell of Pond's cold cream, Aquanet, and recently singed hair, and you had an atmosphere so uniquely 1950s it may as well have required a license to operate. Throughout this process, there was always a hum, a noise, a buzz from an appliance or a spritz from a metal atomizer bottle. Beauty in those days was not a silent affair. It was a chorus. And then came the accessories. The mandatory housecoat, a garment somewhere between a bathrobe and a ceremonial robe of the Order of Dry Shampoo. Slippers, hairnet, possibly pearls, depending on whether one's mascara had come out even. All told, the average weekday morning grooming session was a choreographed performance of heat, powder, restraint, and the occasional curse muffled into a towel. One could argue it was less about vanity and more about fortitude. Which brings us gently to the question, what, or perhaps who, was all this effort even for? Who was this humming pageant intended to impress? Let's just say, the answer may not be who you're expecting. Somewhere between the gentle click of curlers and the cautious scent of setting lotion, the 1950s beauty routine lithely tiptoed from necessity into full-on suburban ritual. And if that ritual sometimes involved enough hairpins to jangle like wind chimes and enough hairspray to paralyze a small ecosystem, well, that was just part of the charm. Let us stroll now, not at all briskly, into the boudoir of mid-century grooming. It is a place where the lighting is soft, the wallpaper is floral, and the air is thick with the scent of Pond's cold cream and murmuring discontent. In this room, an astonishing volume of time and noise was devoted to the pursuit of looking presentable, a phrase whose threshold was, frankly, alarmingly high. Now, history is full of inventions that changed everything. The printing press, penicillin, and arguably the bonnet-style hairdryer. Imagine a deflated inflatable elephant retrofitted to puff warm air rather than trunk blow a trumpet. These contraptions look vaguely like spacesuits for very calm marsupials, and they produce the kind of noise you might expect if you stuck your head inside a small, sleepy hurricane. Picture it, a woman in her bathroom, wrapped turtle-like in robe and plastic tubing. The dryer roars like a wounded zeppelin while she patiently flips through a magazine or listens to Doris Day records, which are valiantly trying to be heard over the appliance's defiance. Conversations under the dryer were mostly mime-based. Eye contact, elaborate eyebrow choreography, and waving one's eyebrows like semaphore flags became standard household communication until the storm of grooming passed. And then there were the curlers. Oh, the curlers. These were metal or plastic or sometimes made of mysterious substances that would not pass modern safety regulations without first being exercised. Women slept in these things, voluntarily. The term beauty sleep became a cruel inside joke. By morning, she might rise with bouncy hair, but she had also inadvertently engraved Morse code onto her scalp. Still, appearance was paramount, and the 1950s were deeply concerned with the appearance of concern. This was the era where you wore lipstick to vacuum, where aprons had lace, and where a woman might not go to the mailbox unless she looked like she'd just breezed in from Pasadena, with pearls. Pearls, mind you, were not optional. They were like fashion punctuation, a full stop to complete the sentence of femininity. The cosmetics industry, for its part, flooded the market with innovations, some helpful, some aspirational. There was a deep love affair with miracle creams, sold in jars ornate enough to double as wedding cake toppers. Ads promised eternal youth for just 3 easy payments and the forfeiture of your nose pores. Cold cream was practically a currency. You weren't just removing makeup, you were participating in a cleansing rite, smearing what looked suspiciously like refrigerated mayonnaise across your face, while murmuring something about clarity. Then, using tissues in an artful, circular remove, you'd erase the traces of the day, and perhaps your patience. This was not a swift undertaking. This was beauty glacial process. Time moved like a soap opera, slowly, with great emotion. Of course, there were also stranger relics, forgotten now to most bathroom shelves. The eyebrow stencils, the spit curls, The curious belief that Vaseline could basically do anything short of babysitting the children. And the daily pinching of cheeks, not to apply blush, mind you, but actually to stimulate the blood flow in what can only be described as a sort of amateur capillary performance article. Health fads mingled freely with the beauty fads, which is how some unlucky souls ended up drinking vinegar, rubbing lemon juice into their elbows, or standing on their heads in the corner of the room in the name of circulation. There were beauty tonics that sparkled and fizzed and tasted like carbonated regret, all in hopes of helping your insides look as pristine as the outside, which, let us remember, was regularly glazed like a bundt cake, and perhaps the most fascinating element of all, aside from the silence-busting gadgets, the warlike metal implements, or the olfactory bravado of perfumes mirroring fruit baskets, is this: the sheer patience. A 1950s woman might spend hours quietly transforming herself with a regimen that required both dexterity and the constitution of a minor alchemist, and then do it all again the next day. But that is what beauty meant then. Not efficiency, but effort. Not speed, but ceremony. The glamour wasn't quick, but it was deliberate, as if each dab, curl, and spritz was a small, polite declaration. We are trying. And that was enough, most days. As we settle in now, drifting gently toward the next story fragment in this curious cosmetic time capsule, keep your eyes closed and your bobby pins metaphorically aligned, because the next part reveals how even the recipe for night cream contained equal parts science and sorcery. There is something deliciously ironic about the fact that in the 1950s, an era outwardly obsessed with elegance and poise, beauty routines often sounded like a small jet engine warming up in a suburban bathroom. A woman might glide across the living room in a perfectly pressed poodle skirt, all smiles and pearl earrings. But behind closed doors, her morning might begin with a fury of whirring metal, crackling heat, and a series of chemical reactions that were technically safe, but only if you squinted hard at the label. Let us begin with the crown jewel of 1950s beauty absurdity, the hairdryer. More accurately, the sit-under-bonnet hairdryer, and even more dramatically, its home-use cousin, which looked like a cross between a scuba diver's worst nightmare and an inflatable pool toy. It was a soft plastic cap connected by a corrugated tube to a base that hummed with the pride of mid-century engineering. Place the hood over your head, flip the switch, and voila, you were now part of the house's HVAC system. These contraptions were not subtle. They sounded like a Hoover vacuum, threatening imminent emotional collapse. And yet, women across America patiently sat for hours beneath their handy hair volcano, flipping through Ladies' Home Journal, while their scalp was gently toasted into a passable bouffant. Hair wasn't the only battlefield. Let's talk about the evening ritual of cleansing. Ah yes, the famous cold cream, a staple as American as apple pie, if apple pie made your pores weep quietly. Cold cream was everywhere, heavy, thick, unapologetically greasy, and packaged in jars so heavy they could double as self-defense weapons. The texture could only be described as spreadable frosting if the frosting was angry. Come nighttime, a hearty scoop of this Arctic sludge was smeared generously across the face in circular motions that, depending on your technique, made you look either politely pensive or like a Victorian ghost mid-transformation. Cold cream was supposed to cleanse and moisturize at the same time, though its primary job seemed to be convincing your pillowcase to commit textile treason by morning. And then there was the curling iron, the medieval cousin to modern flat irons. These were metal rods you'd plug in and pray over, because temperature gauges were for the weak. Were they too cold to work? Unlikely. Too hot to touch? Absolutely. Women learned to test these heated death scepters on a scrap of paper or the back of their hand, like early alchemists with a perm. For lashes, enter the torturous realm of the eyelash curler, shiny, metallic contraptions that looked more like surgical tools than cosmetic aids. The 1950s versions had fewer safeguards and made a series of tiny clinking sounds that registered somewhere between a cash register and a wedding bell run through a mild existential crisis. Many women mastered the skill of clamping their lashes without also yanking out their dignity, though mishaps were not just common. They were practically a rite of passage. And of course, no tour of 1950s beauty. Rituals would be complete without a moment of silence for the terrifyingly noble, do-it-yourself home perm kits. These kits, often sponsored by brands like Tony, promised luscious waves with slogans like, "Which twin has the Tony?" A question that assumed you could perm-identify your way through fraternal confusion. In practice, these kits involved curlers, solutions with mildly alarming chemical names, and a complete suspension of disbelief. The smell alone was enough to ruin a minor friendship. It was somewhere between ammonia, regret, and the sharp smell of 11th grade biology class. But women lined up for it, arm in arm, transforming kitchens into chemical salons worthy of mild EPA oversight. To be fair, there was a certain camaraderie in these odd rituals. Friends would perm each other's hair, mothers would pass down cold cream wisdom, and sisters would belt show tunes while tiptoeing around plugged-in appliances with all the caution of bomb squad technicians. Vanity, yes, but also bonding. And beneath it all was the slow heartbeat of routine, that quiet cadence of caring for oneself, as wild as it may have looked or sounded, done not only out of fashion's demand but out of a kind of ritual devotion. Juxtaposed with today's slick serums and digital tutorials, the 1950s beauty routine feels more like a history of home-based science experiments that accidentally resulted in glamour. In the gentle hum of a cooling curler, in the faint fragrance of roses masking the ghost of ammonia, the decade lives on. Strange, stubborn, and full of character. And just as the sun-melted curlers were finally removed and faces patted dry with satisfaction, something else began to emerge. A ritual not of lotions or lipsticks, but of posture, grace, and control. A performance act in public elegance was on the horizon. But for now, just rest. The next transformation begins soon. Imagine the 1950s bathroom at 6:12 a.m., the hour of the hairdryer hum and cold, linoleum tiles, a sort of porcelain most sacred space where tiled walls echoed the rituals of atomic age self-care. By modern standards, everything was slower and much, much louder. Beauty back then was a clattering orchestration of timers, tubes, and the kind of mechanical whirring that made neighbors suspect you were operating an amateur weather balloon program. Let us begin with one of the era's most distinct contributions to domestic sound pollution, the home hairdryer, or as it was sometimes lovingly referred to in early advertisements, the portable salon experience. This colossal contraption was not the handheld blow dryer we know today. No, this was a beige plastic helmet connected to a hose, connected in turn to a blustery motorized box, roughly the size of a wall safe, which rumbled and wheezed like a small steam engine. Women perched beneath it like drafted airline passengers preparing for flight, flipping through good housekeeping as the warm air circulated around their foam curlers with the gentle grace of a shop vac. The true beauty of these dryers wasn't just in the volume of their output, but in their volume. These machines didn't whisper a breezy whoosh. They howled, they groaned, and they clamped the air with a dull roar that could gently rattle light fixtures. If you were awake at dawn and heard that familiar pulsing hum somewhere down the hall, you had two choices: make coffee or surrender to fate. The lady of the house was preparing for her day, and nothing, not even the Cuban Missile Crisis, could interrupt a properly scheduled dry and set. But the hairdryer was merely the overture. The face itself was a multi-step process involving more jars than a colonial apothecary. Cold cream was queen. We'll get to her lofty reign later, but suffice it to say, every face was a battlefield where cleansing was a full contact sport. If it tingled, it was working. If it burned, congratulations, you were fighting. The good fight for glamour. Face masks came in gooey pastel textures that dried into crackled mosaics, as though one's skin were attempting to radio home from a planet made entirely of mint-scented clay. One must not overlook the ever-consistent ritual of eyebrow maintenance. Tweezers in the 50s were less ergonomic, more dental instrument chic. Steel tools brought out with quiet solemnity, and a magnifying mirror of such brutal honesty, it could unravel one's self-esteem quicker than a genus quiz in biology class. Thin arches were the goal, and advertisements breathlessly suggested that with the correct brow shape, one might easily snag a husband, a job interview, and perhaps a sensible station wagon in one fell swoop. Then came the application of makeup, a routine requiring enough precision to qualify one for civil engineering. Foundation arrived in creamy compacts, applied with petite sponges that bore a striking similarity to breakfast shortbread. Reds and pinks dominated the lipstick palette, and the process of applying it, mirrored, meticulous, was often interrupted to blot, reline and pat just so. This was not a quick swipe before heading out the door, mind you. This was a declaration. Bold lips were a way of saying, yes, I'm going to the grocery store, and yes, I'm going to do it with style, dignity, and 14 layers of Revlon. The finishing touches, powder and perfume, had their own drama. Powder smelled faintly of upholstery. It was applied with billowy puffs the size of hamsters, best dipped into tins that clicked satisfyingly closed. Perfume bottles were glassy little treasures on the vanity, glinting between the roller sets and ashtrays. A dab behind the ears. Another on the wrists. A practice more ritual than scent-based utility. The goal wasn't just to smell nice. It was to carry an atmosphere, wafting mystery down every suburban sidewalk. And speaking of ashtrays, one must understand that the 1950s beauty routine didn't strictly exclude tobacco. There's footage, black and white, vaguely glamorous, of women in bobby pins with a cigarette perched between their fingers, balancing high-fashion nonchalance with hair full of hot curlers. Doctors were slightly more skeptical. Advertisements were not. And so the morning ritual often included a puff, a cup of instant coffee, and a heartfelt promise to never let the mailman see one's before face. Of course, not every woman went through all this each day, but many did. And even those who didn't still knew the beauty script by heart, handed down like heirloom recipes, shared between sisters, mothers, and entire Avon networks fueled by catalogs, coffee cake, and dreams of dewy perfection. So next time you swipe on some concealer at a red light and feel rushed, imagine trying to perfect a winged eyeliner in 1956 with natural light from a casement window and no mirror closer than 8 inches, unless you had the foresight and thumb strength, to wall mount 1. We'll take a deep breath here through a cloud of lavender-scented powder and continue gently onward to an evening where beauty turned nocturnal and cold creams returned for their nightly encore. Downstairs, in the pulse of a 1950s kitchen, toast popped, radios hummed in AM nostalgia, and someone, almost always a woman, was ironing something relentlessly. But upstairs, in the delicate half-light of morning, a different ritual was underway. One that involved more beauty gadgets, bubbly creams, and minor technical hazards than a small spacecraft. Let us drift gently into the sanctum of the 1950s boudoir, a realm where lace curtains filtered sunlight like softened cream. Vanity tables bristled with tools of glamorous ambition, and somewhere nearby, a cat knocked things off a windowsill with terrible indifference. Imagine this. A woman sits before a 3-sided dressing mirror, her shoulders draped in something called a house coat, which was neither particularly warm nor ideal as a coat. On the table before her sits an array of curiosities, tortoiseshell brushes, cold cream jars, pastel lipstick tubes the size of field radios, and a metal contraption that looks suspiciously like it moonlighted as a medieval torture device. Yes, we are talking about the mechanical hair curler. The 1950s was not a time for minimalism in beauty. It was the era when your curls had to be bomb-proof, and your eyelashes could double as frameworks for ambitious art installations. The famed permanent wave machine, used to achieve those luscious shoulder-length curls, looked precisely like something you'd find lurking in a mad scientist's garage. Invented earlier, but still in loyal service in certain salons, the perm machine involved hanging metal rods, clamped onto one's hair, then heated, because nothing says beauty like sizzling your strands into submission. The machine hummed and ticked like a time bomb, and stylists had to time the process just right, lest the client emerged looking like they'd been gently electrocuted, or not so gently. Meanwhile, the home user had her own arsenal. Heat was the weapon of choice. If you didn't own a monstrous wave machine, you might possess a humble but still vaguely life-threatening heated curling brush. Some models had to be plugged in and left to reach temperatures that could weld steel. Naturally, they came with little to no warnings, because nothing beats a morning like burning your bangs into next Thursday. And while the smell of hairspray would come to dominate the coming decades, in the 1950s, it had just begun its sticky, perfumed reign. Hair lacquer, as it was called then, came out of cans with the force of a jet engine and the chemical subtlety of a science experiment gone rogue. There was something brave, almost poetic, about the way women held their breath, sprayed their sculpted coifs, and then waited in silence, praying they wouldn't cough and ruin the whole shellac. The masterpiece. But truly, the unsung hero of the 1950s beauty regimens was cold cream. Always cold, always creamy, cheerfully smeared on like cake frosting. Its primary job was to erase the previous day's battle armor. Foundation, rouge, sorrow. Cold cream was the reset button. It didn't matter if you were 17 or 70, no vanity table was complete without a chili tub of this enigmatic substance. Makeup in the 50s was an art form that prioritized the bold and the bulletproof. Foundation was applied in such solid layers it might reasonably confuse a geologist. A woman might have set her face using powder so fine it practically whispered, and then finished with a lipstick called Fire Engine Red, because when you're cleaning house, you might as well do it with the hue of an emergency vehicle on your face. Mascara, though, mascara, wasn't what you'd recognize today. Before the wand became standard, mascara came in little cake boxes. Yes, like a child's watercolor paint set. Women had to spit or drip water delicately onto the cake, and then use a stiff brush to apply it, with all the precision of a particularly gentle fencer. It kind of worked. Mostly. As long as you sneezed only once every 4 hours. It's worth noting, too, that many of these rituals were performed daily, not for special occasions, but because appearances mattered. Not in a superficial way, necessarily, but in the same sense that a tidy living room or a homemade lemon meringue pie might matter. It was about composure, polish, and the belief that beauty was, perhaps, more of a practiced virtue than a passive trait. And so began the average morning. A symphony of buzzing curlers, smoky compacts, clinking bobby pins, and maybe a faint yelp as a hot iron grazed an earlobe. Coffee downstairs, crisis upstairs, all in preparation for grocery shopping or hosting bridge club. The glamour was deafening. But just wait until we wander into the nighttime rituals, the unwinding of pins, the layer of Pond's cold cream thick enough to survive a nuclear blast, and the curious contraptions women wore to bed to preserve their hairdos for the next day's battle. You see, if morning was for transformation, evening was a quiet undoing, a reverse miracle of uncrinkling and unpinning, of secrets quietly slipping back into jars. There is something oddly poetic about a 1950s vanity table, perched like a shrine to self-enhancement in the corner of many a middle-class bedroom. It was less a piece of furniture and more a stage, complete with an audience of cold cream jars, powder puffs, and hairbrushes worthy of Andromeda. The act of getting ready in the 50s wasn't just preparation, it was performance. A matinee of mirrors, Maybelline, and weirdly optimistic music crackling out of a tabletop radio. Let's picture the scene. It's morning. Early, but not too early. 9:03 a.m., the socially acceptable hour for glamming up in slippers. The sun slinks lazily through sheer drapes. A woman sits at her vanity wearing a quilted housecoat and an expression of focused fortitude, like she's about to perform minor surgery, with peach-colored toner. First, the face. Everything began with cleansing the skin, which in the 1950s seemed less about removing dirt and more about having a slippery wrestling match with a bar of Lifebuoy soap. This bright red bar, slightly aggressive in both hue and smell, promised to wash away troublesome oils, though it often left the skin drier than a martini in a Hemingway novel. Next came the cold cream, a contradiction in a jar. Thick, cold, and with the consistency of lukewarm mayonnaise, it was ladled onto the face with great ceremony, then whisked off with a tissue, leaving behind a vaguely hydrated, vaguely slippery sheen. No one quite knew why it worked, or if it did, but it was what Elizabeth Taylor used, and that was enough scientific evidence for a generation raised on movie, reels and Camel cigarettes. Then came the toner, otherwise known as astringent, a term that to this day makes skin cells quiver. Dickinson's witch hazel, smelling distinctly like something you'd use to clean a stubborn coffee stain, would be briskly slapped onto the cheeks with a cotton ball. This was not a gentle step. If the 1950s had a beauty motto, it might have been, "If it doesn't sting, is it even working?" Once properly cleansed, exfoliated, which meant rubbing your skin like it owed you money, and toned into submission, it was time for foundation. And this is where things got decidedly more theatrical. You see, many creams and powders promised a porcelain finish. What they delivered ranged somewhere between matte perfection and statuesque highway accident. Pancake makeup, despite sounding delicious, was in fact a solid disc you'd activate with water and apply with a sponge, like a very glamorous cement mixer. Once dried, your face became the ideal blank canvas for exactly 1 hour, or until laughter-induced creasing occurred. And then, the pièce de résistance, the noise. Ah yes, beauty was not a silent routine in mid-century America. Every curl, every spray was announced with a rattle, a puff, a pleasant hiss. Hairdryers, those dome-shaped helmets that looked like props from a 1930s science fiction film, could be heard droning from bedrooms across suburbia, making the average Tuesday morning sound like a NASA test launch. You'd sit beneath that humming dome of hot air, casually flipping through Photoplay magazine, while your hair slowly evolved into a styled sculpture. And let's not forget the bobby pins. Oh, the bobby pins. Hundreds of them, scattered like metallic breadcrumbs across linoleum floors, magically disappearing into carpet, only to re-emerge years later by embedding themselves into unsuspecting toes. They were used to set pin curls the night before, secured tight enough to reflect incoming radar. The hair itself wasn't just styled, it was engineered. Backcombing, teasing, spraying. Hairspray, by the way, was applied like crime scene fixer. It wasn't merely misted, it was lacquered. Entire cans of Aquanet sacrificed themselves daily to ensure no hair moved, even when faced with wind, rain, or small nuclear events. And at the end of all this, a woman might finally arrive at the breakfast table looking considerably different from when she began. Cheeks rosy, hair immovable, and lips in some stunning shade of coral. A color that bafflingly suited no one and everyone at once. But underneath the gloss, the spritz, and the strange stickiness of all that setting lotion, there was something almost meditative about the whole ordeal. The slow, repetitive rituals, the little noises, the scent of ponds and powder. In a world of fast change and Cold War nerves, the vanity was a tiny corner of predictable control. And control, dear listener, was more valuable than contour. As we wander away now, with the soft click of a compact and the distant buzz of that warmed-up hairdryer, Still faint in the ether, we'll tiptoe further into another part of the 1950s beauty world, a mysterious land occupied by two primal forces, elbows and etiquette. At the stroke of 9 p.m., somewhere in suburban America in 1955, a peculiar symphony began to echo through thin-walled houses, one part hairdryer, one part aerosol sprays, with undertones of soap opera dialogue humming from a television set the size of a small barn. This wasn't just any nighttime ritual. It was the getting ready for bed beauty routine of the American woman, and it was as complex and orchestrated as a Broadway show, a very, very loud one. Now you might think getting ready for sleep means pulling on pajamas and brushing your teeth. Ah, how darlingly naive. In the 1950s, bedtime was less about surrendering to rest and more about preparing to resemble someone who might eventually rest while always looking camera ready should a neighbor pop by for emergency jello mold advice. Let's begin with the hair. By the 8th tick of the clock, curlers were already in place, giant pastel rollers that looked more industrial than domestic. The favored method of achieving that bouncy post-war wave? Sleep in them. Yes, sleep. On purpose. No mattress was too soft, no pillow too plush to shield the skull from metal and plastic contraptions that resembled medieval armor more than beauty tools. Some even turned to wireframes called hair cages that hovered above the scalp to protect the integrity of their luscious loops. It was like a bonnet, if your bonnet had recently been hired by NASA. The logic was clear. A woman must rise looking effortlessly lovely, even if it meant sleeping like a marble statue in repose. And if sleep did make an appearance, it was purely accidental. Yet the curlers were just the overture. Enter the cold cream. A staple of a mid-century skincare regimen, cold cream was slathered on with the enthusiasm of someone preparing for battle, made with mineral oil, beeswax, and a strange but noble willingness to ignore pore space entirely. This thick, snowy cream was massaged over the whole face, and sometimes neck, because of course the neck mattered. Cold cream didn't just remove makeup, it removed dignity, visibility, and sometimes furniture polish, depending on how much you applied. And then came the lotion layering. Here, things took on a mood both sensual and slightly pharmaceutical. Women would coat themselves in various overnight rejuvenating potions, each promising something different. Firmer skin, fewer wrinkles, softer hands, or in some marketing moments, complete marital bliss by morning. Let us not forget the infamous Hollywood tan. While today's self-tanners lean toward mousse and mitts, the 1950s offered a much more adventurous solution. Tinted lotions that promised a sun-kissed glow, but often delivered something more like dappled pumpkin. Applied at night so the streaks could settle while you dreamed, these lotions were nothing short of optimistic sorcery. Sometimes they even came in shades named California Bronze, or, confusingly, Midnight Honeyglow, which sounded more like a jazz album than a skin tone. And then there was the humming, steaming, gargling chorus of beauty. Steam facials were a pre-sleep ritual for many, using bowls of boiling water with a towel tented over the head to open the pores, followed swiftly by a dab of astringent designed to chase those very same pores back into hiding. There were also electric face massagers, beeping, buzzing chrome gadgets, which, frankly, looked like they belonged on a Star Trek set, but were actually intended to firm the jowls and promote collagen action. Mouthwash use was vigorous, more symbolic than sanitary, gurgled with the determination of someone trying to remove not just germs, but possibly a moral flaw. The bottle, often green and vaguely minty smelling, sat atop mirrored vanities like a chalice in a church of gingival worship. Some nights even featured the slimming girdle, not for wearing, mind you, but for sleeping. Yes, some enterprising women believed that a structured fabric embrace overnight would coax the body into more fashionable terrain by morning. Whether or not this worked, no one knows. But bless their rib cages, they tried. With all of this, curlers, creams, tonics, and unbreathable sleepwear, it's a small miracle anyone got more than 15 minutes of actual rest. But perhaps that wasn't the point. Bedtime in the 1950s was less about the Z's and more about the rituals, the repetition, the performance. It was a well-rehearsed act in front of a mirror framed with round bulbs, an audience of one, cheering you silently with each swipe of lipstick remover and dainty dab of under-eye gel. Our nighttime heroine would finally climb into bed, face glistening like a waxed apple under the glow of a bedside lamp, curlers towering like spires of hope. Was she asleep? Not yet. Not quite. Because just beyond the bedroom door, in another corner of the household, another show was beginning. The beauty routine of the 1950s American man, which was a whole strange symphony of its own. Picture this. It's 1954. The average American home is buzzing, not metaphorically, but literally. Somewhere between the plastic curlers and the percolating coffee pot, there's the clattering buzz of a vintage hairdryer, piercing the wallpapered tranquility like an enthusiastic wasp trapped in a brass trumpet. Yes, tonight we turn our drowsy gaze to perhaps the loudest corner of the 1950s beauty ritual, the home hairdryer. And no, we're not talking about those modern, sleek heat wands with acrobatic nozzles and a cool shot button. We're talking about the kind of appliance that looked suspiciously like an alien probing device smuggled into suburbia via Sears and Roebuck. These early domestic hairdryers were monstrous, resembling a hybrid between a vacuum cleaner hose and a polio-era breathing apparatus. They came neatly nestled inside pastel-colored boxes with multiple tubes, a bonnet that was suspiciously identical to a shower cap, and a hum that could rattle the fillings out of your teeth. Using one was not so much a beauty routine as it was a sonic adventure. Sleepy though the time might have been, imagine crawling into bed while your wife sat at her vanity table, bonnet strapped on, hose snaking down like some high-fashion scuba diver, the machine perched on the floor, growling like a caffeinated fighter jet. Romantic, perhaps. Intimate, no doubt. Quiet. Not a chance. Now, the reason these machines were so substantial wasn't merely because engineers had a vendetta against ears. They were built with the science of the era, which essentially meant taking a fan, attaching a heating coil, and praying it didn't set the drapes on fire. Speed wasn't really the goal in the 1950s beauty routine. The measure of excellence wasn't, how quickly can I dry my hair, but more, can I organize the pork chops, pay the milkman, and possibly complete a crossword while my hair goes from damp to glam. It was all part of an overarching theory in mid-century glamour, that beauty took time, and electricity, and probably asbestos-lined wiring. Those bonnet dryers were particularly fascinating. You'd slip the plastic bonnet over your curls, much like a helmet preparing you for glamour battle. The warm air would inflate the bonnet to a pleasantly bloated size, turning your head into a balloon full of simulated spa wind. Children found this delightful. Cats, notably, did not. But even more astounding was how these devices nestled comfortably into that charming and questionable era of marketing, where femininity was considered so fragile and yet powerful that it needed its own line of small household artillery. Advertisements hailed these devices as liberating machines for the modern housewife on the go, neglecting to mention that you'd be tethered in place for 45 minutes, unable to hear your own thoughts or the telephone ringing from the kitchen wall. And let's not forget the social ritual of drying hair. For some housewives, this was a sacred appointment, a built-in hour of me time in a universe governed by casserole timers and toddler tears. The whir of the dryer became a meditative white noise, like a Buddhist chant, if the monk were a retired mechanic from Cleveland. In salons, these dryers were even more majestic. The iconic beehive hairdryers, those towering contraptions that lowered onto heads like beauty thrones, lined up like pearlescent helmets in a Jetsons meets Greco-Roman tableau. Women would sit beneath them browsing magazines, pearls resting gently on crisp collars, the hairdryer humming like a tired librarian trying to remain composed. What these machines lacked in subtlety, they made up for in ritual. there was a sense of occasion in it all. The heating, the whirring, the slow transmutation from damp defeat to curvaceous curls worthy of any technicolor afternoon. A transformation earned, not applied. And while today's hair tools are silent, sleek, and somewhat robotic in their slick efficiency, there was something oddly comforting about those mid-century beauty beasts. They were cumbersome, yes. They were noisy, certainly. But they were also shared, lived in, and often came with a matching stool, an optimistic instruction manual promising elegance in just 30 easy minutes. As the sound of old dryers fades into a whispered memory, one might wonder, what else in the bathroom cabinet was secretly plotting something elaborate, noisy, or delightfully peculiar? Let's leave the bonnet hanging and tilt softly toward the mystery of cold cream and a jar that promised the face of your dreams with the scent of your grandmother's soap dish. It's late evening in 1953. The sun has poured its last golden drop on an aluminum airstream parked just off Route 66, and somewhere inside, a woman is winding her hair around freshly boiled juice cans, because of course she is. Home perm kits may have promised glamour, but they often delivered chaos. You see, the 1950s were the golden era of the DIY beauty explosion. Sales catalogs used the term convenient like it was a holy incantation, suggesting that anyone, yes, even Mildred from Topeka, could recreate the sleek elegance of Grace Kelly using only kitchen scraps and mild chemical warfare. And so, in this flaxen age of glossy optimism and institutionalized curliness, American women rolled up their sleeves, then promptly rolled their hair around whatever they could get their hands on. Cold cream lids, soda straws, pipe cleaners. Juice cans were in particularly high demand, not for their vitamin C content, but for their circumference. Juice can curls, as they were lovingly called, produced soft, voluminous waves, so long as you didn't mind sleeping with a stack of tinned metal on your skull, like the Tin Man had tried to hug your head. Of course, juice cans weren't made for comfort. They were made for holding juice, so women often turned to yet another 1950s invention, the bonnet hairdryer. Ah yes, the sheer poetry of the bonnet, shaped like a large inflatable shower cap and connected by a corrugated plastic hose to a grumbling tabletop motor the size of a meatloaf. This contraption delivered warm air and existential questions directly to your scalp. You'd sit for hours, sometimes flipping through a Sears Roebuck catalogue, sometimes wondering what unimaginable mistake in the timeline had led to having your head inflated like a souffle in a wind tunnel. The sound, of course, was unforgettable. A low, plasticky whirring that seemed to say, beauty takes time, and also turbulence. Many women compared the experience to drying your hair in the exhaust system of a mid-sized vehicle. If your mother ever drifted off during a bonnet session, the sound of the hose sucking onto her head would continue for another hour, cheerfully simulating a quiet tornado over the land of Nod. No beauty regime in the 1950s was complete without a thorough half-hour of paw boiling. This involved sticking one's head over a pot of steaming water, towel draped over the head like you were trying to exorcise bad spirits or sinus pressure. The goal? To open your pores, soften your skin, and make yourself look like a freshly cooked dumpling. Face steaming kits were sold with alarming enthusiasm. Advertisements claimed they melt your troubles away, although most users later clarified that the only thing melted was their patience. This was the era of noise and neurotic precision, of alarm clock beauty. Nail polish wasn't just a cosmetic, it was a pungent commitment that would knock out small pets within a 3-foot radius. Cold creams were stored in fridge-like compartments next to the fruit cup, and they came with heavy floral scents strong enough to pickle a cucumber. Heaven help you if you tried to layer Pond's cold cream with Helena Rubinstein's Night Cream Supreme. Your skin would never know peace again, and your pillowcase would look like it had just escaped from a wax museum. But oh, the loved rituals. These were not meaningless routines. They were private performances, slow-motion ballets, enacted over vanities cluttered with glass jars and pastel compacts, under the approving eye of a cat-shaped powder puff dispenser and the occasional blinking electric fan. Even amid the clatter and clamour, there was serenity to be found. Filling your metal curlers before bed had the same tranquil rhythm as slicing vegetables. Clean, deliberate, meditative. And no matter how bizarre the techniques, mayonnaise hair masks, beet juice rouge, milk of magnesia primer, each step was suffused with a kind of reverence. You were transforming, one jelly-covered cotton ball at a time, in the quiet hum of that pink-tiled bathroom with fluorescent lighting that somehow made everyone appear both older and fuzzier than reality. Beauty was more than beauty. It was discipline, imagination, and a dash of madness in equal measure. And as another aluminum can finds its home among the curls, and the bonnet hums its lullaby of industrial progress, we drift now toward the next curious invention. A treatment so icy, so sparkly, and so utterly confusing that even the snowflake-shaped bottle couldn't make sense of it. By the time we reached the mid-century mark, the relationship between American women and their hairdryers had become intense. The 1950s didn't just give us malt shops and sock hops. They handed us machines large enough to resemble spacecraft and loud enough to summon neighborhood complaints. These were the hood dryers. And they weren't just tools. They were monuments to patience, perseverance, and the thrilling possibility that beauty might someday be portable. Imagine this. It's a Tuesday morning, mildly overcast. Somewhere in Indiana, a woman is seated like royalty beneath the domed chrome of an at-home hairdryer helmet. She's draped in a housecoat that signals both style and complete strategic surrender. The dryer purrs. No, not purrs, rumbles, audibly. The walls vibrate just slightly. Somewhere upstairs, her husband contemplates reverse engineering the machine into a miniature bomb shelter. These contraptions, resembling a cross between a 1920s radio and a lunar module, were installed in bathrooms across America, wedged in next to high-pressured sinks, soap sculptures, and at least one bottle of Aquanet the size of a fire extinguisher. Beauty required endurance. There were no quick fixes here. Before the sleek blow-dryers of later decades strutted in with their lightweight designs and ionic promises, the 1950s presented the stationary monster, a chair-bound experience in which your head disappeared into a warm, whooshing dome. The process could last up to 90 minutes, depending on your curl ambitions and the sheer willpower of your scalp. You see, setting one's hair in tight curlers was a nightly ritual. And this wasn't a casual, toss-in some rollers situation. It was a mathematical feat, requiring symmetry, foresight, and an understanding of fluid mechanics. In many homes, bobby pins outnumbered teaspoons. Mothers trained daughters, grandmothers coached sympathetically from floral printed beds. 2 mirrors, adequate lighting, and a firm jawline were considered the minimum equipment. Once the rollers were secure, the dryer entered the scene. Loud as a pit orchestra, it filled the space with a dull, steady whoosh, a sound like someone vacuuming your thoughts. People shouted across rooms. Marriages were tested. But hair, once dried, emerged with miraculous structure, each curl like a tamed whirlwind, each wave calculated as if Fibonacci himself had arranged it. Salons, too, were symphonies of sound and scent. Rows of identical hairdryer helmets lined up like compliant robots in a sci-fi hair show. Women sat side by side under the domes, magazines in laps, feet on chrome footrests, sharing family gossip and frosting recipes over the hum of 50 mechanical headwinds. These machines weren't just dryers. They were communal rituals, a place where time paused and buns dropped hints about upcoming bake sales. The experience was so immersive, in fact, that some women described it as meditative, a kind of humming cocoon in which one could momentarily forget laundry piles and PTA meetings and instead dream of the perfect beehive. Though let's be clear, Falling asleep in a hood dryer was risky. One overly enthusiastic snore could jostle rollers, sabotage symmetry, or worse, create the dreaded flat spot known to cause audible gasps and urgent prayer. And oh, the smell of it all. Burnt hair mingled with perfumed setting lotion, a gentle waft of lanolin, which, for the uninitiated, comes from sheep, but was considered chic if applied with the right amount of conviction. The dryers may have been part furnace, but they were also part spa, in a very loud, industrial kind of way. Outside of suburban homes and corner salons, the beauty industry, of course, knew exactly what it was doing. Advertisements promised that owning a personal hood dryer would elevate one's status faster than you could say, glamour gal. The message was clear. If your hair had bounced, so too would your social prospects. Brands like General Electric and Sunbeam tossed their dryers into the ring, manufacturing what were essentially desktop wind tunnels with pastel accents, pink, mint, and pearl. Machines so charming you could almost forget they weighed as much as a modest television set and sounded like an aircraft preparing for descent. So did they work? Oh yes. They dried. They set. They complied, albeit noisily. Hair, once held hostage to humidity and whim, now stood tall and unmoving. A veritable helmet of style. No breeze dared disturb it. No hat dared flatten it. Of course, for those who couldn't afford the machines or the time, there was always improvisation, like sleeping in curlers, a form of mild self-torture known primarily to women of immense bravery and flexible ear cartilage. But that, along with the curious case of the overnight beauty mask that hardened like homemade grout, is a snoozy little subplot for another evening, when beauty sleep requires slightly more commitment than just closing your eyes. If you were to tiptoe back in time and softly open a bathroom door in, say, 1954, you'd be greeted by a curious scene. The low hum of something mechanical, the faint scent of setting lotion, and a woman serenely seated under what looked suspiciously like a metallic UFO landed on her head. Enter the home hairdryer, a staple of 1950s beauty that vibrated gently against the backdrop of Eisenhower-era domestic calm. And yet, these unassuming devices were anything but modest. The early home hairdryers were large, loud, and about as graceful as a lawnmower in a bonnet. They came in two main forms: the helmet-style dome dryers, big enough to make you look like you were preparing for lunar exploration, and the bonnet style, with a hose that puffed warm air into a parachute-like cap. This latter variety made papery rustling sounds like a gossiping sandwich bag and had the remarkable ability to inflate itself with the self-importance of a hot air balloon. The drying process, incredibly, could stretch over an hour, longer if your curls were feeling obstinate. There was no quick blowout here, no Dyson wizardry, no ionic titanium magic, just heating elements, patience, and a good book, possibly titled How to Actually Fall Asleep. Mid-drying underscore. In a twist of cozy domestic multitasking, many women use this time to rest. Bonnet attached, magazine in hand, slippers on. It was beauty meets spa, day meets mild survival prep. Because if that hose detached mid-cycle, you'd get a sudden whoosh of hot air to the face, and the whole contraption would begin whirring around like a caffeinated octopus. Let's not forget setting lotion, that mysterious elixir, half potion, half glue, that helped sculpt those crisp curls and held every teased wave in a defiant architectural standoff with gravity. Setting lotion wasn't just casually spritzed on, it was part of a process. First, it was applied with the gentle reverence of a potion master. Then came the painstaking winding of hair onto curlers. Curlers that were made of metal, plastic, rubber, or in some cases, sheer obstinacy. It wasn't uncommon for women to sleep in these, their heads bristling with small cylindrical ideas like fashionable porcupines dreaming of page boys. And while we're here, let's talk about curlers. The type of curler you used spoke quietly of your personality. Sponge curlers. You probably enjoyed a quieter night and had an eye for comfort. Metal mesh. You were serious about your set and not afraid of a mild scalp tingling. Plastic rollers with clips. Practical, efficient, brave in the face of potential breakage. Hair wasn't only being curled, though. No, it was being trained. Shaped like a bonsai tree, gently reminded of its responsibilities to the next day's silhouette. Beauty sleep wasn't just a phrase. Your hair, your skin, even your self-esteem often participated in an overnight miracle, a little before and after ritual that turned weary 9 p.m. you into a polished morning goddess by dawn. If, of course, everything went according to plan, and your bonnet dryer didn't attack your cat in the middle of the night. Now, the volume of these beauty devices deserves a pause. One hairdryer could sound like a small plane was attempting takeoff in the hallway. Many were compared, quite fondly, to Hoover vacuum cleaners, both in decibel level and weight. You didn't carry a home dryer, you committed to it. This, too, is worth remembering. The 1950s beauty routine was not something to be rushed. It was not a 10-minute, get-out-the-door routine. It was a ritual, a quiet assertion of identity amidst the Tupperware parties and TV dinners, a moment of solitude, humming with heat and possibility. And if you wandered down a suburban street at night, you might spot them. Silhouettes in upstairs windows, crowned with curlers and haloed in the soft roar of bonnet dryers. Domestic goddesses in training, patting their curls, flipping through Ladies' Home Journal, and preparing to face the world one coiffed wave at a time. As the dryer hum fades into the background, like a lullaby narrated by the household appliances themselves, we gently close this door on the world of bonnet beasts and setting spells, just in time to peek around a new corner where curious concoctions and creams of questionable origin await, the peculiar potions of 1950s skincare, whispered to work wonders and guaranteed to smell mildly like furniture polish. By the time we reach the realm of 1950s eye beauty, we've already passed through a thicket of odd routines, clattering tools, and unexpected ingredients. But now, now, we arrive at the eyes. The so-called windows to the soul, although in the 1950s, many of those windows seem to have thick curtains, blackout blinds, and a little flick of Revlon's Midnight Mystery eyeliner for good measure. Let's begin, ever so softly, with the eyebrow, that majestic tuft of expressive keratin elevated in the 1950s to architectural status. Eyebrows were not just curated, they were structured like miniature aqueducts of glamour. Inspired by starlets like Elizabeth Taylor and Audrey Hepburn, the fashionable brow of the day arched like the gateway to flawlessness, and woe betide the woman who left hers untamed. To achieve this righteous ridge of face-top foliage, many women wielded tweezers like precision instruments, and sometimes like medieval torture devices. Hair by hair, they sculpted arches sharp enough to signal ships at sea. But when Mother Nature didn't cooperate, and nature, frankly, rarely did, some women reached for eyebrow stencils. Yes, stencils. Little cardboard masks placed over the brows, through which one might trace a cartoonishly perfect outline with pencil, powder, or occasionally a tiny sponge soaked in dampened cake pigment. That's right, cake mascara, which we'll tiptoe into momentarily. First, perhaps you'd like to gently imagine the sound of an eyelash curler clicking softly near a vanity mirror. The humble curler, about as calming as a lobster claw, if you didn't know how to use one, was heated over light bulbs or warm water to add drama to otherwise modest lashes. Beauty, darling, was a performance art. And the lashes, they were the grand finale. Enter cake mascara, a charmingly strange predecessor to the tubes we know today. It looked like a tiny black soap bar and lived in a compact beside a stiff little brush that resembled a toothbrush after a stressful week. The user would spit, not very ladylike, but honest, or add a splash of water directly onto the cake, then swirl the brush around in it to create a mysterious black paste. Then, with surgical precision or reckless abandon, depending on one's mood and hand steadiness, They would paint each lash individually, as if preparing them for an art exhibit. As if that weren't enough, some ladies even applied a second layer of powder between mascara applications. That's right. After one layer of paste, they dust their lashes in fine translucent powder and then reapply another coat of mascara over the top. The effect? Lashes like double-decker buses. Twice the volume, slightly unwieldy, but very impressive in profile. Then came eyeliner. While today's flicks and wings are executed with the gentle ease of a liquid wand, in the 1950s, many women turned again to cake varieties, activated with water or even petroleum jelly, drawn on with tiny angled brushes that looked like the toothbrush's cynical cousin. The cat eye became a rite of passage, drawn to startling lengths, occasionally straying into cartographic territory. Maps of daring, carved in jet black strokes across sleepy eyelids. Speaking of sleepy lids, eyeshadow was not yet the rainbow explosion it would become in later decades. No neon palettes here. Think shoulder pads. Not yet. Think glitter. You hush your mouth. Back then, eyeshadow came in 3 shades: beige, grey, and a rebellious blue. If one wanted to go truly audacious, a hint of lilac might appear, but only under the cover of dim lighting and strong gin. The application method? With a small sponge or fingertip, one faded, the pigment gently outward toward the temple, producing a sort of soft, theatrical sadness. The effect could say, "I may have just cried, but I still remember how to contour." So much of the 1950s beauty eye routine was an homage to geometry. Angles and arches, lines and lashes, all precisely placed to create an illusion of effortless allure, though the effort could take over an hour and feel like an optical engineering exam. One eye done? Lovely. Now do it again. Backwards. And just as the last lash was set, brows immaculately arched like swans mid-flight, and shadows perfectly brushed to a moody blur, there it remained, a tiny mirror perched upon a vanity, reflecting the 1,000 small decisions it took to be effortlessly beautiful in a decade where beauty was more blueprint than instinct. Drifting now, like a powdered eyelid into twilight, will gently brush past the eye and descend just a little lower, arriving at a delicate, strangely pressing question. How exactly did one handle the peculiar art of the 1950s manicure? Somewhere between the whirring of a tabletop hairdryer and the sound of nylons being tugged up with hopeful precision, we arrive at a curious plot twist in the world of 1950s beauty, the baffling, clattering, and oddly glamorous invention known as the home facial steamer. Yes, by mid-century, people were not just steaming vegetables, they were gently misting their own faces in the name of glamour, health, and exceptionally open pores. Now, these weren't the sleek, spa-style steamers you might see glowing next to folded towels and tiny eucalyptus sprigs today. In the 1950s, the home facial steamer resembled something between a soup pot and a small locomotive. Imagine a metal base, often with chrome detailing because everything had to shine like a tail fin, and a hood that looked suspiciously like it belonged in a sci-fi film about intergalactic beauty queens. Some were small and tabletop friendly, others were freestanding, only slightly less intimidating than a dentist's X-ray rig. The concept was simple, if a smidge theatrical. You poured water into the base, maybe even added a few drops of rosewater if you were feeling decadent, and then waited, patiently, for it to heat. Minutes passed. Steam began to rise. You inserted your face into the dome or hovered solemnly over it, like an aristocrat peering into a crystal ball and discovering, surprisingly, refreshed skin. Why all this steaming? According to beauty manuals of the day, steam opened up the pores, purified the skin, and prepared the canvas for creams and cold creams alike. Opening your pores was considered roughly as vital as brushing your teeth, moisturizing, or locating your correct red lipstick. Even Hollywood embraced the steamy ritual. Actresses were often photographed with their heads wrapped in towels, eyes closed in spiritual serenity, as steam swirled around them like enchanted fog. Nobody spoke about the sweat or the mild claustrophobia or the tendency for one's eyeliner to melt into a Rorschach test of personal decisions. For the amateur beautician, steamers came in various levels of complexity and puffery. Some models offered multiple settings, which gave the illusion of surgical precision, though in truth, it was more like toying with a kettle, low boil or very loud boil. Others included attachments that resembled garden hoses with funnels. One model even allowed you to steam while seated, which advertised itself as ideal for the multitasker, someone who hoped to read the latest serial in Good Housekeeping while her face liquefied ever so gently. Added to the charm of steaming was the full spa ritual, which usually involved a series of steps meticulously followed by the beauty-conscious 1950s woman. First, wash with a soap that claimed to be complexion calming, which often meant it smelled faintly like kitchen cleanser. Then, steam for precisely 8 to 10 minutes. Not a moment more, lest your skin prune. Afterward, apply toner briskly, as though encouraging your facial features to firm up their work ethic. Finally, pat on a cold cream, ideally while listening to Perry Como and contemplating your next bridge night. Of course, as with many steps in the 1950s beauty regimen, steaming was not a quick process. By the time steam rose to appropriate puffiness, your evening might already be halfway over. But the goal wasn't speed. It was ritual. The 1950s adored a good ritual. From polishing chrome ashtrays to arranging lipstick tubes by color intensity, everything had a process. Beauty wasn't just personal care. It was choreography. It was an evening performance starring you, curtain at 8:15. Not everyone was sold on steaming. Some dermatologists of the day gently suggested it wasn't entirely necessary. A few even hinted it could dry out the skin. A scandalous notion that was mostly ignored in favor of misty mystique. After all, how could something that felt so ethereally spa-like possibly be bad? The answer, of course, was rarely in the results, but always in the ritual. It's hard to criticize a practice that gives you 10 uninterrupted minutes to be still, warm, and vaguely mystical. In the end, steaming wasn't just the act of treating one's face. It was a tiny, humming rebellion against the chaos of daily life. Children squabbling, dishwasher rattling apart, a birthday cake collapsing in the oven again. No matter. For 10 minutes, you had steam, serenity, and the unwavering belief that everything, including your T-zone, was going to be just fine. And as the final wisps of vapor curled gently toward the ceiling, we now float softly toward another marvel of mid-century beauty that required just as much patience and, rather astonishingly, even more electricity. To truly savor the curious charm of 1950s beauty habits, one must venture past the lipstick counters and potions that fizzed and step into the mysteriously perfumed world of hair care, where the stakes were high, the hairstyles higher, and the contraptions surreal enough to make a Victorian dentist blush. Let's begin with perhaps the most regally bizarre of all beauty routines, the home perm. Now, a perm, short for permanent wave, was the magical method by which women could transform their God-given hair into a robust, spring-loaded helmet of curls. On television, smiling housewives looked delighted to have their scalps seared with curling solution and then wound around rods tighter than a submarine hatch. But the reality was a little steamier, a little stinkier, and a lot less comfortable. To understand the ordeal, imagine sitting in your kitchen, cloak around your shoulders, neck craned at a precarious angle. Your scalp tingles ominously as ammonium thioglycolate, or perm juice, as some women called it with reverent resignation, seeps into every follicle. It smelled like a chemical love letter from a skunk. Then, with rollers set, you'd be attached to a permanent wave machine so large and humming that it resembled an octopus in search of a power outlet. This beast, often reserved for salon use, had a series of long metal tentacles dangling from a central heating core. Each tentacle was attached to a curler, which had been clamped to tufts of your hair. Once powered on, the whole contraption emitted a soft whirring that grew into a suspicious sizzle. It was like auditioning for a role as a cyborg in a noir science fiction series called Wave Me Tender. Homemakers accepted this sizzling ritual as simply part of looking polished, because unlike today's casual updo or bedhead aesthetic, 1950s hair was a full-time job. Hair wasn't just put up. It was engineered, coaxed, lacquered, and occasionally threatened into architectural feats. Speaking of which, hairspray was both a styling necessity and an olfactory adventure. The leading brand, Aquanet, could hold not only curls but the very fabric of time itself. It was applied with the same care and volume used by modern agricultural crop dusters. Bedrooms were often left cloaked in a thin chemical fog, which some claim could hold a beehive intact during a hurricane, or at the very least, a jitterbug competition. But perhaps the most meditative aspect of 1950s hair maintenance was the nightly ritual of setting one's curls. Imagine our fictional friend, Doris, mother of 3, veteran of PTA bake sales, and undisputed queen of the Tupperware party circuit, leaning over her vanity each evening. With military precision, she'd divide her freshly washed hair into precise sections, each wound tightly around a pink plastic roller. These rollers weren't small. Lying on them felt like sleeping on a parking lot of marshmallow boulders. And yet, women managed. Some even claimed they could sleep soundly. Despite the medieval headgear, the scent of leftover hairspray lingering like ambition after prom night, and the perpetual fear of the rogue bobby pin. For those with less patience, there were quick-fix methods, such as the bonnet hairdryer. Picture a puffy cap attached by a long hose to a countertop machine that sounded like a small propeller engine. When turned on, it whooshed and hummed like the soft awakening of a mild domestic storm. As warm air inflated the bonnet, wearers sat motionless and angelic, cocoons in curlers, casually flipping through magazines filled with beauty tips from actresses who likely had professional teams and full spinal support. Of course, men too had their rituals, though fewer involved curling irons and more involved pomade. But that, perhaps, is a tremor of history for another soft moment. And so, as our imaginary 1950s evening draws to a close, and the last metal hairpin finds its home for the night, we tuck our rollers beneath a silk scarf, ease into a starched bed, and let the soft whoosh of the bonnet dryer fade into the quiet hum of sleep. Somewhere between the atomic age and the rise of disco, women dreamed under the silent weight of pink curlers, their heads held high, literally and figuratively. Because beauty in the 1950s wasn't just skin deep, it was sculpted, spritzed, and occasionally slightly singed. Now, as the last bobby pin settles into its cushion and the scent of Aquanet fades into the tender shadows, we turn our gaze toward the next beauty secret hidden within the folds of history's satin pillow. As we settle further into the golden haze of 1950s beauty culture, where steam curled through kitchens and cold cream doubled as an existential salve, we drift now into one of the decade's more peculiar customs. The beauty parlor appointment, a weekly rite as sacred as church and twice as gossipy. Imagine it. It's a Tuesday. Cookie-cutter homes stretch beneath a powder blue sky, trimmed with white picket fences and dreams of Tupperware parties, and dotting the suburban streets like tiny shrines to vanity and Aquanet sit the beauty parlors. Not salons, parlors. Parlors had personality and perms. On this typical Tuesday, Margaret, our fictitious but very punctual parlor-goer, clutches her handbag and her weekly issues of Ladies' Home Journal and Modern Screen. She breezes into Luella's House of Hair, where the linoleum floor gleams, the air smells of singed hair and violets, and the time feels just slightly bent, like Bobby Darin's still singing from the radio, even if the record stopped. The sights inside are dazzling. Helmets, for one thing. Hairdryers bigger than a toddler's playfort line the walls, massive, bulbous contraptions that engulf the head, like some sci-fi imagining of a Martian interrogation device. Once strapped in, you could hear neither gossip nor God. But you could definitely feel the heat, and not the metaphorical kind. Under these domes, women flipped through magazines, cocked a cigarette, just so, and occasionally caught a glance of their spiral, curler-adorned reflection, like they were peering into a funhouse version of themselves. And here's the strange beauty of it. No one looked strange to each other. Sitting baking under dryers for 2 hours was perfectly ordinary, which is exactly what made it seem extraordinary. Margaret, of course, waits patiently for her turn with Luella, the regal queen of curl. Every beauty parlor had a Luella or a Mabel, women who wielded a teasing comb like a knight's sword, whose bobby pin placement could only be described as architectural. These hair mavens were part stylist, part therapist, part amateur meteorologist, because truly, no one monitored humidity like a woman trying to predict the lifespan of a bouffant. You may wonder, why the fuss? Why the hours spent on setting, curling, drying and preening? The answer lies in the cultural recipe of the time. Glamour wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. You weren't simply getting your hair done. You were maintaining morale. Your lips didn't just wear lipstick. They bore the blood-red flag of civilization. A good set could last a week. That's right, a week. You weren't meant to wash your hair every day. That would defeat the purpose. Instead, women employed a triumph of styling strategy, sleeping in pin curls twisted tighter than any Cold War secret, swaddling their heads in satin scarves, and moving through their days with the elegant caution of museum guards carrying priceless Ming vases. And yet, somehow, all this effort felt wonderfully social. The parlor was the original portal to community. News traveled faster through hair salons than the postal service. By sitting still for 2 hours, wrapped in curlers with your ears ringing from the dryer's fan, you could leave with a French twist and 5 new recipes, 3 neighborly scandals, and an existential debate over whether Tab Hunter or Rock Hudson had finer bone structure. Even the tools were fascinatingly elaborate. Comb sets, metal curlers, those hair picks that resembled medieval farming equipment. They all lived in a woman's bathroom like sacred relics of the Church of Glam. And heaven forbid anyone touch your hairspray shelf. It took a cocktail of chemistry more volatile than a middle school science fair to keep your style in place. To be sure, it wasn't always comfortable. Hours on end in stiff-backed chairs, enduring the occasional scolding from a distracted stylist whose curling iron strayed too close. But it was a ritual, a weekly transformation, a moment to be seen, even while half swallowed by an electric dryer. And perhaps most comforting of all, there was the smell. That odd warm cocktail of setting lotion, powder, and overheated electrical cords. A scent that whispered, "Here, you will be glamorous, even if it kills us all." As Margaret's rollers are finally removed and her sculpted, gravity-defying crown of hair revealed, it's clear that beauty was never simply about looking good. It was about effort. About saying, even in small suburban battles against frizz, I showed up for life. With curls. Now let's drift into quieter realms. Not far, just a few dream steps onward, to where beauty extended beyond the salons and peeked into another realm. Body-shaping magic, elastic fortresses, and the surprisingly heroic saga of mid-century undergarments. But that's a secret we'll untuck gently in the next quiet hour. Eventually, a woman had to leave the house. You could only sit under a hairdryer for so long before the brain began to hum at the same frequency as early television static. And the outside world, well, that presented an entirely new catalogue of beauty-related considerations. Leaving the house in the 1950s wasn't just a casual matter of keys, wallet, lipstick. No, it was closer to preparing for a theatrical debut, albeit one that involved a great deal more nylon. To step onto a Publix sidewalk without stockings was considered a small act of social rebellion. Women wore them not just out of politeness or style, but because the collective memory of the war years, when nylons were rationed and some women painted lines down the backs of their legs to simulate seams, still echoed like a soft footstep behind them. Pantyhose hadn't been invented yet, so stockings were held up by suspender belts or garter clasps that snapped with the dispassionate efficiency of typewriters, both noisy tools of their respective trades. Shoes, though elegant, were not built for comfort or long-distance travel. Heels clacked sharply against pavement, announcing one's approach like a Morse code message meant only for linoleum and tile. If you wanted to look polite, you suffered politely. Never mind that the average day might involve walking to the butcher, the post office, and then the laundromat, all while pretending your toes weren't staging a minor revolt. Gloves were another, essential part of going outside and looking like a proper mid-century lady. Full-fingered, wrist-length, or elbow-hugging, gloves were not just accessories. They were armor, accessories, and sometimes accidental community bulletin boards. A woman might remove her glove in order to shake hands or eat finger sandwiches, only to find herself slipping it back on with the slow melancholy of someone folding up a love letter. Gloves added mystery, of course. You never quite knew if someone's hands were powdered, manicured, or simply crossed internally. And then, of course, there was the curious and competitive art of perfume. Today's perfume is a gentle mist, a polite whisper of eucalyptus and regret. Not so in the 1950s. Perfume then was a declaration. You didn't wear it so much as wield it. Scents like Chanel No. 5, Evening in Paris, and Shalimar practically swaggered into the room before you did, pulling up a chair and starting small talk with the furniture. Applying perfume was a ritual. You dabbed it on your wrist, behind your ears, and for good measure, some even misted the hems of their skirts, as if anticipating that the bottom 6 inches of their wardrobe would need to smell mysterious too. A 1950s beauty routinely carried a purse heavy enough to substitute as a blunt self-defense object. Inside it you'd find a compact mirror, loose powder, a lipstick in a fire engine hue, tissues folded with such precision they might have been origami, and more bobby pins than physics could reasonably explain. Hair was sculpted into place and absolutely must stay there. A strong gust of wind could be a personal betrayal. Even sunglasses had their own etiquette. Cat-eye frames with rhinestones were not just eyewear, they were punctuation, like a closing parenthesis to a well-executed look. They implied mystery, glamour, and a faint touch of defiance, as though the wearer might vanish into a movie set at any moment. Yet beyond all the effort, the noise, the ritualized precision of leaving the house, there was an unmistakable sense of ceremony to it all. Today we dash out in sweatpants and pretend it's athleisure. But then, venturing into the public eye was a choreographed performance. You put on your heels, your gloves, your lipstick and perfume, each a piece of armor and expression, and walked virtuously into the world like a woman who had tamed her own chaos, if only cosmetically. Of course, no outing was complete without a touch-up stop, somewhere between the restroom of a department store and the double-check mirror in your compact. Lipstick reapplied. Bangs patted. Powder dusted across the nose in feathery strokes. Like clockwork. Like grace under fluorescent lights. As the sidewalks grew busier and the department stores filled with carefully made-up women, each accompanied by her own little cloud of hairspray and hope, one couldn't help but feel that the 1950s beauty was not just performing society's script, but editing it slightly with every sway of the hips, every adjusted glove, every confident swipe of a powder puff. Of course, for many, once the day's performances came to an end, nightfall brought its own rituals, because beauty, like any great production, required careful striking of the set. And somewhere, between moonlight and cold cream, another very peculiar bedtime routine waited. Somewhere between the clatter of a metal eyelash curler and the rattle of a cold cream jar being firmly closed, the 1950s beauty routine makes itself known. Not with a whisper, but with a polite, ladylike knock on the door, and perhaps a faint spritz of lilac cologne hanging in the hallway. Let's open that door, shall we? By the post-war era, American women had settled into a curious ritual of transformation, 1 part elegance, 3 parts noise. The average beauty regimen began not with a serum or a soothing face mist, but with a low, electrified hum, either of a hairdryer that resembled an alien spacecraft, or of a mysterious contraption known affectionately and fearfully as the facial sauna. Imagine, if you will, a helmet-like dome connected by a coiling snake-like hose to a hot, steaming base. A woman, towel around her shoulders and robe tied with the dignity of a spa matador, would gently slide her head into the dome. This was not, despite appearances, an attempt to radio SOS messages to Mars. No, this was pursuit of poor perfection. Steam would swirl about like a Gatsby party gone wrong, and after several minutes of facial fog and a few coughs later, she'd emerge with the glisten of a well-prepped canvas, ready, supposedly, for things to get serious. But before makeup, there was maintenance. Eyebrows, those silent sentinels of expression, got careful attention. Tweezers shaped them with nearly ecclesiastical devotion. Arching too much could render a face too dramatic, unless, of course, one was planning on mourning something mysteriously French. Then the peels. Yes, peels. Facial masks in the 50s had all the tactile charm of fruit roll-ups. Women would paint a viscous formula over their faces and wait, statuesque, for it to dry. Then began the great satisfaction, the peel. It came off in sheets, like old wallpaper surrendering to time. If your face came away intact and glue-free, it was considered a success. If not, well, better luck next Thursday. Let's not overlook the faintly villainous beauty gadgets that occupied countertops. There was the chin strap, a firm elastic band that looped under the jaw and over the top of the head with all the gentleness of a disciplinary bonnet. It promised firmness, youthfulness, and very likely a few neck creaks by morning. And in case gravity hadn't been fully intimidated, the vacuum beauty massager cheerfully sucked at the cheeks in rhythmic pulses, as if trying to convince them to return to a higher altitude. Among the noisiest additions to the vanity arsenal was the home hairdryer, glorious in ambition, thunderous in practice. Early versions involved a hefty base and a plastic cap connected by a corrugated tube, with a sound not unlike that of traveling inside a mild typhoon. Women could sit under these for hours, reading magazines, perhaps knitting booties, or just reflecting on the brave new world in which their hair could be dried without ever moving their feet. It was, unintentionally, meditative, a ritual that was 1 part grooming, 1 part enduring. And through it all, the lingering scent of Pond's cold cream hung in the background like the ghost of skincare past. Ah, Pond's, venerated white goo of the gods. It removed makeup, moisturized skin, and occasionally made door handles slippery. Across the country, countertops were littered with cold cream pots, rouge tins, and hairpins that seemed to multiply like rabbits. And yet, amid the regimens involving devices resembling light machinery and procedures that could open pores or test one's patience, there was something comforting in the predictability. These routines, elaborate though they were, gave rhythm to days and offered a momentary domain entirely of one's own. Of course, not everyone partook. Some women opted for simplicity, a swipe of lipstick and a brush through the hair before embarking into the world. But the mythology of the 1950s beauty ideal, the hour invested, the clink of metal curlers, the hum of something ever so slightly suspect, those echoes remain. You can nearly hear it now, the muffled roar of a bonnet dryer and the hushed anticipation of a face scrub that's beginning to tighten. Things were not always efficient or quiet, but perhaps, in their strange, syrupy way, they were a balm, routine as ritual, and ritual as reassurance. As the stampless helmets are set aside and the night cream massaged into moonlit cheeks, our story tiptoes toward the next curiously scented corner of mid-century beauty, where, Lipstick wasn't just makeup. It was an entire language. At the quiet center of 1950s beauty, a vortex of hairspray clouds and pastel bathroom tiles, we must now pause to pay tribute to a monument of womanly determination, the home perm. You may think curling your hair today requires a wand and a playlist. In 1955, it required chemical warfare readiness, a strong marital bond, and a towel you could afford to lose forever. Imagine the scene: a suburban kitchen, Friday evening. The children temporarily stunned into silence by Captain Kangaroo, the husband vaguely aware that something was happening. In front of the sink stood the lady of the house, sleeves rolled, hair partitioned like a civil engineering project, gripping a small plastic bottle with a skull and crossbones level of intensity. The windows were open. The cat was nowhere to be found. The air held the scent of destiny and ammonium thioglycolate. The 1950s home perm kits, triumphs of Cold War chemistry. Aid promised convenience, but delivered a mild existential crisis. Women followed diagrams that resembled missile launch blueprints, carefully wrapping damp, soon-to-be momentarily unrecognizable hair onto narrow rods that clamped down with all the subtlety of a bear trap. Once the hair was wound tighter than a Tupperware lid, the solution was applied, cautiously, reverently, and ideally with the guidance of a very brave friend with surgical gloves and no sense of smell. The experience, by most first-hand accounts, involves stinging eyes, a vaguely hissing sound, and at least one moment of spiritual surrender. But if you waited the required eternity, somewhere between 15 minutes and geological epochs, you'd rinse it out with tepid water, blot gently, and pray. Next came the neutralizer, applied with the optimistic belief that it would counteract the potion you just poured on your skull. Did it actually restore balance, or did it simply confuse your follicles into resignation? Historians remain undecided. Now, not every woman was game to treat her scalp like a 10th grade science fair. Salons, too, offered the service, but with larger contraptions. If you've ever had the pleasure of seeing a vintage salon, perhaps in a period drama or old commercial featuring simultaneously glamorous and concerned women, you've seen the mastermind-looking permanent wave machines. These were large, vaguely robotic creatures, with long wires descending like jellyfish tentacles, each ending in strange heated clamps that attached to the generous curls of lady customers seated below, smiling in terror beneath exacting stylists. These machines didn't so much curl as forge the hair into submission. Early versions in the 1930s could deliver second-degree burns, and though technology improved by the 50s, the basic vibe remained. If Frankenstein's lab did hairdos, this was it. But curls, you see, were aspirational in the 1950s. The loose, luminous waves of movie stars. Like Rita Hayworth didn't simply happen. They required architecture, ambition, and occasional property damage. For those without the courage or insurance required for a perm, there remained an easier but longer method: rag curls or pin curls done entirely by hand overnight. Each evening, women would wind strands of hair into compact little nests and pin them tightly to the scalp. Some used curlers that resembled medieval instrument parts. Others wrapped them in strips of old cloth. The effect by morning was reliably inconsistent, but generally curly. And in the meantime, you'd sleep only on one side, like a flamingo with neck issues. Yet beauty wasn't only about curls. It was about presentation, posture, persistence. And that's where the grace of ritual took over. After curling came brushing. So much brushing. Women were advised to brush their hair 100 times a day for shine, discipline, and what one Vogue editor called moral clarity. They weren't joking. It's hard to overstate how much time went into these nightly preparations, especially since at the center of it all was the unspoken rule. Under no circumstance should your husband ever see you in the raw, pin-curled, cold-creamed state of beautification. A woman's beauty was like a swan, serene above the water, paddling like absolute madness underneath. Some would even wake half an hour before their spouses to remove curlers, refresh their lipstick, and glide back into bed as though the morning dew itself had lovingly styled them. This was, it seems, the era of stealth glamour. And all of it, perms, pin curls, 4 a.m. lipstick touch-ups, was done without irony. Because beauty, in the 1950s, was a tapestry embroidered with effort, myth, and a great deal of patience involving an airborne mist of aquanet. Now, as the scent of cold cream lingers softly in the air, and the curlers have been carefully placed on their porcelain perch for the night, we slip gently toward another, curious corner of the cosmetics chronicle, where faces were frozen, not with fear, but with something rather chillier. There's something poetic about the 1950s bathroom cabinet. Inside, neatly lined up like soldiers awaiting orders before the mirror, were jars of cold cream, tins of pomade, glass bottles with mysterious floral labels, and gadgets that hummed, buzzed, or occasionally startled pets. And nestled among these relics of vanity was a small, curious thing that would take the decade by storm: the home facial steaming kit. Let's set the scene. Imagine a modest suburban bathroom lit by soft, buttery sconces, a warm, pink-tiled sanctuary where a woman, still wearing her housecoat and curlers, carefully unfolds her evening routine with all the gravitas of a concert pianist. On the countertop sits a fully operational facial steamer the size of a blender. And this was no passive puff of spa-like mist. No. This was an aggressive, borderline volcanic emission of steam, created by heating a carefully placed cup of water to levels most tea kettles would politely excuse themselves from. Though the idea of steaming one's pores is ancient, traced back to Roman baths and herbal tents of antiquity, it was the 1950s that said, let's mechanize it and sell it on QVC before QVC even exists. Companies like Lady Sunbeam and General Electric produced plug-in steamers in cheerful pastels, blushing pink, robin's egg blue, and a particularly bold chartreuse that could double as a waking aid at 6 in the morning. To use it properly was a bit of a saga. First, you poured a very specific amount of distilled water into the reservoir, which no one could ever measure correctly. Then, with a dramatic twist of a plastic cap and the turn of a violently labeled knob, the device would begin its slow, ominous hum. Within moments, steam would erupt from a nozzle in great glorious bursts, like a polite geyser, a face-sized, humidified eruption of beauty. The user was instructed to lean over, drape a towel over their head like a ghost at a spa, and allow their pores to open up and receive blessings, or something fairly similar according to the instruction booklets, which all read like stern letters from a school nurse with a flair for the romantic. The steamer was supposedly doing holy work, banishing blackheads, smoothing complexions, and detoxifying the skin. Magazines swore by it. Your best friend's cousin's mother claimed it cured her migraines. Even men were encouraged to steam before a shave, although this usually led to more steam escaping from the bathroom and the occasional fire department visit. It wasn't just about the steaming, though. There was ritual. While the face was blasted with moist air, women would meditate, or more accurately, they sat in exquisite boredom, leafing through Reader's Digest or listening to the rhythmic drip of a faucet that needed fixing since 1949. 10 minutes of steaming was considered ideal. 11 would absolutely drain you of essential oils, according to one bulletin of beauty pamphlet. Allegedly. And what would follow the steam was even more elaborate. With pores freshly unsealed and freshly steamed like dumplings, women would apply masks of various concoctions, green clay, egg whites, even mashed bananas combined with a frenzied devotion to patience. Then, naturally, came the cold water splash, followed by vigorous patting with a washcloth that had served generations. Really, those washcloths were indestructible. The result? A glow, perhaps, or redness. But most importantly, satisfaction. The satisfaction of having performed a ritual, of taming one's visage by the ancient and magnetic power of fog. The facial steamer joined a long tradition of objects that simultaneously promised self-care and caused low-grade anxiety, a sort of beauty volcano parked on your vanity. It hummed. It glowed. It occasionally sputtered. and if you used it, or too long, you'd emerge looking faintly like a lobster in a silk robe, but a clean lobster, ready for lipstick and an evening of reruns. As the steamer hissed and sighed into the wallpapered air, it left a dewy nostalgia on everything it touched. It was part of a time when personal beauty required ceremony, patience, and a tolerable amount of exposure to minor scalding. And if the steamer was the warm-up act, what came next was no less theatrical. For as steam dissolved into the walls like yesterday's dreams, something magical would often rise in its place, something with pins, spray, and geometry, something delightfully architectural. We slip now gently into the world of the 1950s hairdo. By the time the 1950s rolled around, the humble act of bathing had become something of a mid-century performance piece. Long gone were the quick scrubs of the Victorian washtub days. In fact, the average American homemaker in 1956 might have treated her bathroom like a sacred shrine, equal parts temple to hygiene and laboratory of glamour, or at least as glamorous as one could feel while trying not to slip on a puddle of almond-scented bath oil. First, we must consider the bath itself, a drawn ritual of steaming porcelain and aromatic concoctions. Bubble bath had steadily risen to stardom. Brands like Mr. Bubble would march in during the following decade like a frothy pink parade. But even in the 50s, perfumed liquid soap was being added with a confident glug. And there one might soak, not simply to relax, but to soften the skin before the great exfoliation. Now exfoliation, as it turns out, was practiced with considerable enthusiasm, often involving tools from the mildly questionable category. Pumice stones, loofahs the size of a nervous cat, even brushes on metal twists that looked less like skincare devices and more like instruments for chimney sweeping. Some beauty advice columns that decade cheerfully suggested rubbing knees and elbows with lemon, halves dipped in baking soda. The scent was refreshing, and if it scrubbed the dignity right off you, well, that was simply your epidermis getting a fresh start. But perhaps no bath ritual was more curious than the chilling devotion to cold rinses. Yes, after a loyal soak in near-scalding water, many were advised to end with a bracing cold splash, to seal the pores, invigorate the spirit, and confirm definitively that you were alive. This brave act was often followed by a 15-minute sit in a towel cocoon, sipping warm tea and pondering life's great mysteries, such as why anyone would willingly repeat this tomorrow. When one finally emerged, smooth of limb, slightly steamy, and possibly shivering, the drying process was treated like a military operation. Towels were thick, fluffy, sometimes monogrammed if Lady Luck smiled on your linen closet. And talcum powder, oh, so much talcum powder. Sprinkle it, puff it, cloud the air like a colonial musketeer, and hope you didn't inhale too deeply. Johnson's baby powder was the reigning monarch of the bathroom cabinet, dusting generations with its signature scent and fine, ghostly mist. Talc, it was believed, helped absorb moisture and kept one fresh, a euphemism that vaguely pointed in every direction. For some, the powder was perfumed. For others, it was tinted. There were even whole-body deodorants that promised day-long daintiness, which sounds like the title of a lost Jane Austen novel, or perhaps a 1950s sitcom that aired just after The Moisture Chronicles. Then came lotions and creams. The average 1950s woman was expected to lather herself like bread in a sandwich factory. There were creams from Europe, creams from New Jersey, creams that claimed to quicken cell turnover, though what precisely that meant in 1953 remains uncertain. Some women swore by the cold cream ritual, applying thick Noxema or Pond's and then gently removing it with a warm cloth, as if wiping away one's sins via moisturizer. Behind the veil of all this daily devotion was a deeper pursuit, achieving idealized skin that appeared baby-soft, betrayal-free, and above all, matte. Shine was public enemy number one, and powders were its sworn executioner. Thus, post-bath, a delicate face powdering often followed, even at home in case one needed to look presentable for the milkman, the neighbors, or a rogue traveling encyclopedia salesman. And then there were the beautifying gadgets, many of which hummed, clacked, or vibrated ominously. Facial massagers with rolling metal balls that claim to exercise the skin, a phrase that suggests your skin might go jogging later. Steamers shaped like miniature space helmets. Even infrared light ones designed to increase circulation and make you feel like a glamorous potato being slow-baked by the future. The whole experience might take over an hour, more if one truly committed to every mask, mist, and mysterious device. Yet for many, these slow, elaborate rituals were less about vanity and more about carving out a moment of quiet self-importance during a decade when women were often expected to be invisible, except when impeccably visible. And so, she would eventually emerge, powdered, perfumed, radiant in a quilted bathrobe with tiny pearls on the collar. Not quite ready for bed yet, of course. The night held other, stranger tasks, including a curious 1950s obsession with bedtime shapewear. But that's a compression tale for a different moment. Now, let's gently open the bathroom cabinet door of the 1950s. Quietly, in case something inside explodes, hisses, or starts glowing. Because here, in the waning years of the post-war beauty boom, beauty routine had become less of a morning ritual and more of a full-blown scientific expedition, with puff applicators instead of pipettes and creams promising atomic radiance rather than actual sun protection. By the early 1950s, American homes were buzzing with optimism. The economy was bouncy, babies were booming, and people had disposable income for the first time in a while. So what did women do with this newfound prosperity? They bought face masks that smelled suspiciously like rubber cement and hair-drying helmets that looked like borrowed bits from the aviation industry. Let's begin with cold cream. Cold cream, ah yes, that eternal paste of slightly soured roses and anonymous fats, remained a staple of every woman's nightly facial undoing. But now it came with slogans like, "reveals the real you," which was possibly a threat. Dug into jars the size of soup bowls, cold cream wasn't just cooling, it was aggressively involved. It clung like a baby koala, melting makeup, hope, and possibly a layer of astrological chart off your face. And then came the loud tools. Oh, the tools. If today's beauty gadgets whisper futurism, those sleek jade rollers and barely buzzing LED masks, the 1950s shouted with electric. Contraptions that looked like interrogation devices but promised rejuvenation. Take the Vibra Massage Facelifter, a boxy, plug-in marvel, if your idea of marvels included holding a purring lawnmower to your cheeks for 15 minutes a day. There were also beauty masks that plugged into the wall. Sculpted from stiff plastic or slightly flexible rubber, they wrapped around the face like a sleep-deprived superhero's disguise. Worn nightly, they promised to reshape sagging skin or terrify one's husband into sleeping in the den. Hair care deserved its own parade. Women used heated rollers roughly the size and temperature of freshly baked baguettes. They'd roll them into their hair with priest-like precision, clip them into place with what may as well have been industrial clamps, and then sit under a bonnet hairdryer, a portable wind tunnel that roared for 45 minutes and made phone conversation impossible. Not that it mattered. No one could hear anything anyhow over the turbine whine of Mrs. Jenkins' waves set dry. And don't even think about skipping your setting lotion. Without it, your curls would droop like forgotten party balloons. Setting lotion, for the uninitiated, was a miracle fluid that held curls tighter than a 1950s grandmother held grudges. Many recipes were gloriously homemade, involving gelatin, sugar water, or whatever children weren't using from the fridge. As for makeup, this was the era of commitment. Lipstick wasn't just lipstick. It was a declaration. And so naturally, the 24-hour kiss-proof lipstick line was born. These shades were determined, ruthless, and nearly impossible to remove. Many women had to rely on petroleum jelly, gentle sandpaper, or diplomacy to get them off. Mascara was still climbing the evolutionary ladder. Most came in dry cake form, requiring a tiny flat brush, a squirt of water, and some internal monologue about life's choices. You'd swirl the brush like a wizard's wand and apply it, with the dexterity of a calligrapher designing legal contracts. Clumpy? Always. Flaking? Like a snow globe. But oh, the lashes. Heavy as curtains, dramatic as opera. And we mustn't forget Pond's angel face powder, which wasn't just makeup. It was an atmospheric event. With just one swirl of the puff, you could veil your entire dining room table. Clouds of finely milled pastel or beige would hover in the air like disappointed ghosts of geishas past. Why did they go through all this? Because in the 1950s, looking polished wasn't just aesthetic, it was etiquette. It was social capital, self-worth, and a subtle shout to the world. I respect myself enough to iron my face nightly with heat and chemicals. There was dignity in these rituals, even if they were loud, even if they were strange. Of course, by the end of the routine, women weren't just ready for bed. They were technically defying physics. And yet, brightly, they smiled, lips shellacked, cheeks powdered, curlers crusted with setting spray, all to meet the morning with grace, a little glamour, and possibly a second-degree burn. Let us now press the off switch on the hairdryer, turn down the buzz of the facial toner, and settle quietly into the twilight, where beauty noise fades into hush. Ahead lies a quieter moment and more curious inventions, perhaps ones that came in tiny tubes, promised eternal youth, and smelled faintly of oddly perfumed ambition. By the dim glow of a boudoir lamp, lavender perfumed and humming with the steady whir of curlers, the 1950s transformed beauty into its own miniature industrial revolution. Every woman's vanity table was a workbench, and the morning routine, less get ready with me, more start the engines and prepare for liftoff. Among the more surprising participants in this domestic space age were the grand dames of hair-setting technology. There was the bonnet hairdryer, part comforting cloud, part spacecraft docking station. It cloaked one's head in a soft quilted dome and then proceeded to emit the gentle roar of a jet turbine. Any attempt at conversation was rendered irrelevant unless one shouted as though summoning livestock from across a canyon. And yet, this was progress. In previous decades, women had perched under massive, wall-mounted dryers at the salon like eggs in a mechanized incubator. Now, in the cozy confines of a pastel-tinted bathroom, the future could hover warmly over your scalp while you reviewed the latest ladies' home journal. Time was not economized so much as ceremoniously invested. Even the application of nail polish had its own ecosystem of patience. Before quick-dry topcoats and salon-speed manicures, drying polish involved careful hand fanning, occasional blowing, which only made things worse, and a fair amount of prayer. Certain women swore by holding their nails beneath fridge air vents. Others sat near open windows like decorative houseplants, rooted, poised, yet deeply vulnerable to the breeze. But if one sacred ritual dominated the nightly beauty wind down in mid-century suburbia, it was the application of cold cream. Yes, cold cream. Soft, white, and the consistency of melted ice cream that had stunned and then embraced you. Generously slathered in circular motions across the face, it was a nightly baptism in moisturized purity. Long before hyaluronic acid serums with suspiciously futuristic names, there was cold cream, unapologetically greasy, unapologetically thorough. Its purpose was simple: to sweep away the day's sins, makeup, city dust, house dust, child hand smudges, and even a faint trace of existential longing. Then came the warm washcloth, gently steamed from the sink, to remove the day's labor and reveal a formidable glow. A glow of resilience, of hope, of a woman who'd survived pin curls, perilous eyeliner, and a pressure cooker dinner. Meanwhile, certain contraptions resembled low-key instruments of steampunk, of villainy. There was the facial exerciser, a headgear-like harness that wrapped around the wall of the skull and gently electroshocked the cheeks into submission. It was supposed to firm and lift the face through gentle muscle stimulation. What it more commonly did was spark vague unease in the neighbors and confuse the dog. Housewives would sit, perfectly still, reading a Reader's Digest, while little electric impulses danced across their temples like tiny, enthusiastic percussionists. And then there were the eye masks. Not the silky, lavender-scented types we know today, mind you, but full-on sculptural affairs that looked like they'd been borrowed from a fencing match or a spaceship. These rigid plastic masks rested uncomfortably on the face and claimed to de-puff the eyes using vaguely scientific principles that seemed to involve magnets and blind faith. They were sold with names like the Beautytron 3000 or Eye Demythifier, and often featured diagrams that looked as if they'd been traced directly from a Cold War patent filing. All of it, the rolling, the heating, the electrifying, was carried out with great affection and seriousness. Because amid the chaos of rotary phones, jello salads, and backyard bomb drills, there was a kind of sanctuary in the strange beauty rituals of the era. They were predictably odd, fascinatingly loud, and executed with an almost monastic devotion. Yes, the woman of the 50s may have risked electrocution for the promise of cheek muscle tone, and yes, she may have gone to bed smelling faintly of Noxima, milk of magnesia, and iron, thanks to the bobby pins perpetually lodged like steel hedgehogs in her head. But she went to sleep, knowing she had done her due diligence in the weird and wonderful pursuit of beauty. And in those final still moments before drifting off, curlers snug, cream absorbed, and face slightly tingly from questionable voltage, if she heard the distant purr of her neighbor's bonnet dryer or saw the faint glow of someone else's vanity light across the street, she might smile. Because beauty in the 1950s wasn't quiet or quick, but it was shared. And as the night stretched softly over suburbia, wrapping each house in shadows and dreams, the woman sighed, turned off the lamp, and let tomorrow's beauty begin. Slowly, strangely, wonderfully. Let's tiptoe now into the final hush of our story. As we draw the curtains on the world of mid-century beauty, let us take one final stroll through the softly glowing vanity mirrors of the 1950s, those round-lamped orbs framed in chrome, reflecting not just faces, but the quiet hopes of women perfecting their fifth lipstick layer before 9 a.m. By now, the average woman's morning routine might rival the checklist of a submarine launch. First came the pre-dawn application of cold cream, a texture somewhere between whipped meringue and regret, massaged lovingly onto the skin in sweeping, circular motions until every inch of cheek and chin felt like it had been kneaded like a fine French baguette. Beauty sleep was, ironically, the least restful part of the day. The radio might hum Perry Como in the background, while an honest-to-goodness bonnet-style hairdryer, about as quiet as a jet engine stuffed into a closet, roared above it all, securely fastened onto the head like a satin scuba helmet. Women flipped through Good Housekeeping, unable to hear a single word of it, lips mouthing articles they couldn't possibly comprehend over the machinery whirring like a mid-level aircraft carrier. And the beauty contests. The 1950s treated these pageants not just as innocent entertainment, but as socio-political affairs. Cities crowned teenage girls as Miss Peaches, Miss Transit Authority, or, in one of history's more splendid moments, Miss Tire Recapping, 1956. Somewhere between sociological satire and full-blown parade, these rituals turned beauty into city bureaucracy. Across America, perfume was dabbed, all wrists and romance, although some fragrances seemed inspired by a department store's floral aisle colliding with a sugar refinery. Evening in Paris, Chanel No. 5, and the ever-mysterious Taboo, which promised intrigue but sometimes delivered your date into a sneezing fit. Mascara was applied with a brush that resembled something you'd use to furl miniature sails. False lashes were held in place with glue that had the stubbornness of cold taffy. And beneath these luscious lashes, stiffened with petroleum-based confidence, women blinked into the mirror like showgirls preparing for intergalactic travel. Let us not forget the corset's slightly less vindictive cousin, the girdle. A 1950s girl couldn't just zip up a dress and go. No. First, she climbed into a panzer of elastic, tiny zippers, and ambition. The result was a bombshell silhouette, an hourglass so defined it could double as a sundial. And the bouffant, the glorious, cloud-like tower of teased hair. Achieved through a sacred rite known as backcombing, it lifted otherwise innocent strands skyward into defiant glory. Achieving proper volume required hairspray so durable it might rebuff mosquitoes, hurricanes, and possibly time itself. One brand proudly claimed its formula could withstand 30 miles per hour of wind. Practical? Perhaps. Unsettling? Yes, also that. All of this for a trip to the grocery store, or perhaps bridge night at Martha's down the street, where gelatin molds quivered with shrimp entombed like fossils. Yes, beauty in the 1950s was not casual. It was a performance, a ritual, and, in some ways, a gentle bit of theatre. But beneath the mascara, the pancake foundation, and the 60-decibel blow-dryers, there was something else glinting through. A quiet celebration of womanhood at a curious crossroad. These rituals, however elaborate or eyebrow-raising, weren't solely about charm or allure. They were little declarations of identity. Lipstick lines drawn not just around lips, but around the self. In bedrooms tucked behind lace curtains, amid perfume atomizers and velvet-lined powder boxes, women press play on new records and older dreams. They shaped their image, their voice, their laugh, even as the world told them how to be. Each pin curl rolled, each elbow-gloved hand raised at a community banquet was a kind of silent negotiation, with tradition, with freedom, with expectation. Yes, much of it now seems strange, louder than necessary, slower than it had to be. But therein lies the charm, because every absurd thing was done with breathtaking sincerity. And now, the room quiets. The hairdryer winds down its long mechanical sigh. The last curl is unfurled, the lights dimmed, the cold cream tucked quietly back into the drawer. Even the rouge has retired for the night. So lie back, eyes soft as satin bows, and rest in the gentle absurdity of it all. History, after all, is just yesterday's ritual bathed in moonlight.